This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is science fiction. I will be speaking with two experts on its history and its properties, and the conversation will begin in a moment. I have Paul Kincaid and Jason Sanford talking about science fiction and its history in prose fiction. Let me just ask both of them to give a definition of science fiction and who they are. So let me start with Paul. Paul, if you could just give me a little background about yourself and how you would define science fiction.
Okay. I've been writing about science fiction since the late 1970s. I've had books of essays and reviews published. I've contributed to major critical works like the Science Fiction Encyclopedia, and I have a book on Ian M. Banks coming out from Illinois University Press in May, June of this year. And I spent most of those 40, 50 years trying to work out what on earth science fiction is. It's been a favourite topic of mine, and I still haven't arrived at an answer. I don't think there is a workable definition of science fiction. I believe that science fiction is, as Damon Knight said, what we point to when we say science fiction. It's something we recognise, but you can't quantify it, you can't qualify it, because every time you put forward a definition of science fiction, you will end up excluding books that most people would say, that must be science fiction. And you would similarly include books that are clearly not science fiction. I once calculated, I don't know if you've ever come across Darko Suvin's definition of science fiction. He talks a bit in terms of cognitive estrangement, which is fine, sounds really good, all the academics use it, except I worked out that you could apply cognitive estrangement to everything from Jane Austen to Oliver Twist without any problem whatsoever. There is no way of limiting a definition to just what we call science fiction. So there is no definition of science fiction.
Jason, a little bit about yourself and how you would define science fiction.
Mainly a science fiction author, short stories published in more than a dozen stories in the British magazine Interzone, Asimov Science Fiction, a number of other magazines. I was a Nebula Award finalist a few years ago. I've written a number of critical essays. I love studying the history of science fiction and fantasy and all genre history. And I kind of agree with Paul. I mean, it's very difficult to define, and anytime you find a definition, it seems to limit what books can be included in that. And I find a lot of definitions of science fiction come down to more the author's agenda or the critic's agenda than an actual definition that can, encompass the genre. For myself, I kind of, when people ask me, because people ask all the time, oh, you're a science fiction author. What is science fiction? And I tend to tell them, because people know fantasy very well, but science fiction in this day and age is not as, at least in the literary realm, it's not as popular as fantasy. I say science fiction are things that are and could be extrapolated from, science and the world as we know it now to the possible futures. Fantasy is more of things that aren't and could never be, but even that's a very limited definition. One thing I remember I've thought on a lot is I see science fiction as more of a worldview. It's a way to set up to understand certain types of literature so you can approach it and understand it and read it. If you have a, quote, the fantasy worldview, you can approach a story with dragons or, castles and, the whole Game of Thrones type thing and understand the world and get into the story. It's the same with science fiction. It's a bit of a worldview so you can approach and say, okay, I understand faster than light ships and starships and all that kind of stuff. But even that's very limited, and I'm not sure how useful it is because there's so much more to science fiction than what I'm saying.
All right, well, let's end this segment right here. In the next segment, I want to talk about the history of science fiction from the beginning. We'll do that in a moment. continuing on about science fiction, especially written science fiction, I want to talk about the history, but before we do, I just wanted to touch on one element that I missed out in talking about what it is, and that is plot versus character. Excuse me. I know I've often said that character is plot. We read stories because we want to know about the individual. We want to know about Grendel or Beowulf. We want to know about Ahab. We're not really so much interested in, going over the high waves after Moby Dick as we are about the crew of the Pequod. And yet, most genres seems to be dominated by plot. If we have a romance novel, it's not so much we're reading about the man and the woman that are having an illicit affair. If we're reading about the Western, it's usually the cattle baron or the railroad merchant that's coming to town to do bad stuff. And in similar ways, science fiction to me has always seemed to be dragging by its feet versus, say, what we would call literary fiction in terms of characterization. The best example is, I think, for example, the Foundation trilogy of Asimov is, you can argue, is a great novel, a great series of books. But admittedly, the plot, the psychohistory, has precedence over the characters. Let me start with you, Paul. Would you agree with that, that science fiction, like other genres, tends to emphasize the plot that makes it a genre over the characterization of the characters within the tale?
Let me put it this way. I think the works that are most close to the centre of genre tend to do that. I think the works that try to follow genre guidelines, if you like, that try to tick all the boxes, tend to be like that. The more interesting work, I think, tends to be away from the centre, away from the heartland of science fiction, and that usually follows very much the same novelistic virtues as just about any other form of literature. And you can find science fiction novels that are really major works of literature, just as you can find science fiction novels that are, well, absolute dross. It's you get the range as you do in any other branch of literature, but it's not exclusively a characteristic of science fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Paul on that. And part of that, I think, and what you're coming from is a lot of the classic Golden Age works of Golden Age science fiction. There was a real mindset that, you were focused on back in the 50s and, 40s, 50s, and 60s, you were focused more on the science and the story, the plot, and the characters. Some of the editors then, John Campbell, for example, would kind of frown upon a story that brought in a lot of emotion, at the expense of perhaps the scientific extrapolation and the future extrapolation and all that. But that definitely changed. When we get time to go through the history of science fiction, when you get to the 60s and the New Wave movement, which came out of England and other number of authors, I mean, that totally broke with that. And you began getting science fiction that, not that there wasn't examples from before, but you start getting science fiction that was very, character driven, and it's set as high or stylistic and written examples or standards as anything published in literature. And when you get into books like Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, one of the great works of 20th century literature, period. It's a science fiction novel, actually over four books plus a coda, which can stand with any of the masterpieces of all 20th century literature from all cultures and around the world. So, I mean, it depends on the story you're looking for. But yeah, I mean, there was a trend during parts of science fiction history where that was true, and there is still science fiction, a lot of it written like that, but that's the same of every, literary genre out there. As Sturgeon said in his famous Sturgeon's Law, 90% of everything is crap. Yeah, 90% of science fiction is crap. Then, as Sturgeon said, a famous science fiction author, 90% of all things are crap. So, yeah.
Well, there's debate over the origin of the novel period, regardless of genre. Some people will go back to Don Quixote. Others will go back to some stuff from 1,000 years earlier that had some prose elements. Other people will go to the tale of Genji in Japan. I'm just looking over some online timelines of science fiction, and there doesn't seem to be any agreement over what was the first science fiction novel. One place will list it as Thomas More's Utopia. Another one just here from The Guardian in the UK says that a 400-year-old science fiction novel called The Chemical Wedding in 1616 was the first one.
Yeah.
What is there? Is there any sort of Rosetta Stone that's considered the first by most critics, Paul?
There was a long period of time when Brian Aldiss's contention that Frankenstein was the first science fiction novel was accepted by an awful lot of critics. Most of those critics are completely wrong. As I said before, if you can't define science fiction, which you can't, then you can't say where it starts. My view of it tends to be that there are an awful lot of books, things like Utopia, Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, Francis Godwin's Man in the Moon, Margaret Cavendish's Blazing World, Swift's Gulliver's Travels, Shelley's Frankenstein, all of which contribute elements that became central to science fiction at one point or other during its history.
Mm.
Whether that makes any of them the first science fiction novel is debatable.
Yeah.
But I don't think you will read two histories of science fiction, and there are an awful lot of them out about now. I don't think you will read two histories of science fiction which choose the same starting point.
Yeah, I know. I read years ago Fontenelle's Conversations on the Pluralities of Worlds, and it's an interesting work, but I myself wouldn't have called it sci-fi, since he's merely speculating about a world and telling this to this countess or this duchess or something, whereas to me, science fiction would be more actually immersed within the tale. Had that character, instead of telling the Duchess about these other worlds, had he traveled to them, then I could see that's more like science fiction. And the same thing with like Gulliver's Travels.
Utopia.
Yeah.
Utopia.
Yeah.
500 years ago, and Raphael Hifliday has travelled to this other world, this city of Utopia.
Yeah.
You know, he is immersed in it. The whole book is his description of that. In that respect, it's science fiction.
Yeah.
There are technological advances he describes in that. So in that respect, it's science fiction. There are political changes and cultural changes that he describes. So again, in that respect, it's science fiction.
Yeah.
Yet in other respects, it's a satire on what was happening in England at that time.
Yeah.
It's a commentary on the church by a churchman. In that respect, it's not science fiction.
Yeah.
You can't tie it down.
Go ahead.
If I can jump in
Yeah,
here.
go ahead.
One thing, again, like Paul said, it gets back to the definition of science fiction, and there is no one science fiction definition that works. In fact, if you find one you like, I guarantee you somebody's going to, in the genre or elsewhere, is going to just attack you and rip you to shreds over it. But one thing I really love, Cory Doctorow, who wrote Little Brother and a number of other science fiction novels, he made a point that really resonated with me when he was talking about how science fiction isn't about predicting the future. It's about creating the future in some ways. You know, like, for example, you could say that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which, you know, has been put forward as one of the early science fiction novels, the science is really bad in it. I mean, you know, if you look, from our point of view. But what the novel did is, one, at the time, she was going from as strong a science as she could, perhaps, in some ways, but she was setting the stage for for ideas and moving the stories into the human consciousness about manipulating life, what science could do to both help and harm the world, things like that. And I guess that's what Cory Doctorow was talking about, is that, you know, it's like, it's not that Frankenstein predicted the future of what to come. That story helped set up humanity to understand what we could be dealing with in the future. You know, it kind of set us on the path to what we now have now, where you could in a few years perhaps create your own Frankenstein in your backyard basement or whatever. And that's gambling a bit.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Frankenstein is how much it has shaped our ideas about science ever since.
Exactly.
When we had fuss about genetic engineering in our food a few years ago in Britain, the headlines were Frankenstein food. When you have any problem with science, Frankenstein appears in the headline. It is the thing that has shaped our whole relationship with science for 200 years.
That's what I was trying to say, is that, the best science fiction reshapes how humanity views science and our relationship to the world. Utopia, you could say, it totally reshaped how humanity, the type of how we viewed the world. So to me, the best science fiction does that. And that's why the definition is so loose, is that because you can have a great work of fiction that reshapes how we see the world, and from a nitpicking point of view, you could say, well, that's not science fiction. But to me, the ultimate impact of that story was totally science fiction, if that makes sense.
Did Frankenstein cast sort of a shadow over the rest of the 19th century in the sense that, you got the mad scientist meme from Frankenstein? Was the next half century or so, until maybe Jules Verne came along, dominated by mad scientists in what would have been called science fiction, or was that just a blip? Was there other things emerging?
Well, one of the things that came during that century was the whole sense of identity, what it is to be a person, what it is to be an individual. Part of that does come from Frankenstein, but you also get it in a very different way in things like Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg, or Jekyll and Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. And that was one of the key ideas that developed through that time. It was also a time when science itself was just beginning. The word scientist was coined in, I think, the 1830s.
Yeah.
Used for the first time in a conference sometime at that point. So the nature of what science did and how science related to everybody's life was a key component of what was going on, the intellectual ferment that was the 19th century, which is why major works like Darwin's Origin of Species came out of that. And a lot of the people who argued about Darwin one way or the other were also people who were involved one way or another in science fiction. Up to and including, well, in particular, Wells.
Yeah, it looks to me, when just scanning some of the names of the people that wrote in the 19th century what would be called science fiction, that there wasn't this sort of ghettoization of it as a genre. Because you mentioned Robert Louis Stevenson, and he's probably most well known even today for Treasure Island, which is a children's book, and yet he did Jekyll and Hyde. And probably a couple of other things. Jack London, who's most famous for Call of the Wild, did a number of sci-fi books in the early 20th century. And even Edgar Allan Poe, I'm seeing here, some people have said that some of his stories have some sci-fi elements. Were writers of other genres more freely dipping in and out of science fiction in the 19th century? And when did the idea that somehow science fiction was lesser come along? Was that during the Edgar Rice Burroughs kind of stuff? Because Verne and then later H.G. Wells seemed to not have that stigma to them that came in the early 20th century.
But there were no borders between genres at that time. People would write what they wanted to write. So Wells would write his science fiction, his scientific romances, as he called them. He would also write great social novels, comedies, histories, and stuff like that. Verne did not consider himself a science fiction writer.
Yeah.
He was just a writer. He was just a storyteller. I think,
and I believe Verne didn't Verne also write a famous travelogue? That was actually what he was most known for, I think, in the 1860s and 70s. Travels across Europe or something.
Well, all of his work was actually basically travels.
Yeah.
So it was, there was no division. I mean, his first book was 5 Weeks in a Balloon, which is hardly science fiction. It was just about people traveling across. I think it was across Africa in a balloon.
Yeah.
I think the division, the fact that science fiction became a second-class branch of literature, didn't really come until probably the 1920s, with the launch of the pulp magazines. And there was a deliberate espousal of cheap, crude, popular fiction, which was, saw itself as distinct from what the great writers of the day were writing, and of course the great writers of the day did not want to be associated with the cheap, crude, popular fiction. So divisions developed then. But through the 19th century and on into probably the first decade and a half of the 20th century, no divisions.
Well, I agree with that. I totally agree with that too. I mean, absolutely. And one thing to keep in mind, Dan, is I can give you my short, 2-minute summary of science fiction history when you're ready. One trend I'm seeing lately is I think we're starting to see a kind of a return, some degrees, a return to where it doesn't matter if the author writes in genre these days. I mean, you've got Cormac McCarthy writing With the Road, a science fiction novel. You've got a number of famous authors, quote, who are from the, quote, high literary traditions in this country and around the world who get back and forth into science fiction and fantasy themes. And it's not, it's people don't care as much. Now, I still truly believe that in this day and age, the big, science fiction, fantasy, different genres are marketing terms to a great degree. And I say that as someone who's submitting a novel to agents, and you get to hear this rejection. Hey, I love this novel, but it kind of blurs the lines between fantasy and science fiction. I'm not sure I could sell it. It makes you, as a writer, you just want to scream about that. They're like, oh, I love this novel, but I don't know if I could sell it because it doesn't fit neatly into a marketing category.
As a reader, that excites me. I think an awful lot of readers want books that blur boundaries. Exactly. It's only the marketing that causes the problems. So the marketing divisions of publishers and the buyers in bookshops. Yeah.
Oh, I agree. I mean, to follow up on what Paul was saying, I mean, I'm gonna go ahead and give you my and Paul, I know you'll correct me if I'm. It's going to be an oversimplification, Dan. But I mean, I was when you were telling us you want to talk about the history of science fiction, sci-fi prose, science fiction prose. It's such a broad topic, but I mean, stepping up from what the pulp, we really had science fiction be labeled as such during the pulp era, which is during the Great Depression. Starting in the 20s, before and then during the Depression, 30s and 40s. You then had editor John Campbell with one of the most famous science fiction magazines of all time. The magazine eventually became known as Analog. He really pushed a very strong focus on telling accurate science, extrapolating possible futures from all that. Like I mentioned earlier, emotions was generally kind of frowned upon, except for a sense of wonder. You wanted a strong sense of wonder, but you didn't want to have your characters devolve into personal, family problems or something like that. That Campbell and his editing style would have frowned upon that. I don't want a couple of pages of family drama or something like that unless it ties into the larger science and sense of wonder. So from that tradition, you have the what they call the big three in American science fiction. Or not just American and English science fiction, I'll say, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke. But then in the 50s and early 60s, you had the New Wave movement, which which started over in England with the influential magazine New Worlds. Then you had Michael Moorcock, J.G. Ballard, Ursula Le Guin, Harlan Ellison, Joanna Rush, one of my favorite authors, Samuel Delany. His novel Dahlgren is also one of those, classics of world literature. That's one of the best novels of the 20th century, and it is as far from being, the type of science fiction of Robert Heinlein as you could get, but it's still what I would call science fiction. Then you go into cyberpunk, in the 80s with, Neuromancer with William Gibson, works by Bruce Sterling, Pat Cadigan. We're talking dystopian, concerned with meshing of humanity and technology and all of that. It's not as much an idealistic sense of wonder type of science fiction, but it's still science fiction. Then you get the new space opera that in some ways is still with us, where, basically it's like classic Isaac Asimov science fiction space opera, but updated for the new world that we're living in. You think Ian Banks, Alistair Reynolds, Stephen Baxter's, all the way up to like new works like Ancillary Justice, like Anne Leckie and such. And I guess, and then you even have the political science fiction. You've got works by like The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, which since a certain election here in the United States, everybody's been talking about how important 1984, George Orwell's novel 1984 is. 1984 is bullshit for understanding the world as today. Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler is what people should be reading if they want to understand the world that has come out of this election and that preceded the election. That's just my view. You have Margaret Atwood and The Handmaid's Tale, and speaking of an author who hates the term science fiction, but, so we got the political science fiction like that. We also have the environmental science fiction, Wind Up Girl, Paolo Bacigalupi, Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogies and other books, and then we've also had a counter-revolution in science fiction where people go, hey, I want the old-fashioned science fiction. So basically it's, it's the golden age of science fiction, rewritten and just continually churned out the same old stuff. So, I'm not trying to oversimplify it. Yeah, I am. But, there's so much history in science fiction, and it has every one of those different types of stories over the last century could, follow a different definition of science fiction. You have people who love one type of author and who hate another, and one type of story and hate another. So, it's a complex subject on all that, but yet there it is. It's all science fiction.
Well, let me turn back, though, before we get, I want to go sort of semi-chronologically here, I just want to talk about...
I messed you up, didn't I? Sorry.
No problem. I just want to talk about Verne and Wells before we move on to the pulp era, because Paul had mentioned the long shadow cast by Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, but it seems to me that when I look at the works of, say, especially Wells, War of the Worlds and Moreau and the Time Machine, that it seems to me that virtually every major subgenre of science fiction he at least touched upon, even if he didn't write the defining canonical thing. That he has mutants, he has time travel, he has space invaders, and a handful of others in some lesser known works. Would you say that most people, I guess non-science fiction, would look at Verne and Wells as sort of the two sort of end of the 19th century titans? Is that an accurate portrayal, that these two guys especially sort of define science fiction going into the 20th century?
Yeah. Wells in particular, I think in the five major scientific romances he wrote between 1895 and 1901, he effectively invented most of the tropes that we still see in science fiction today. The Time Machine wasn't, strictly speaking, the first time machine in literature. There was a Spanish novel from, I think, 2 or 3 years earlier, which had a machine that travelled through time. But that was a very different type of thing. Well, Wells's was the first controlled journey through time. Then you get Moreau and the idea that animals can be remade, humans can be remade. War of the Worlds, the invasion. We'd had a tradition tradition in Britain, starting in 1870, time of the Franco-Prussian War. Germany was reunifying and was suddenly changing the entire balance of power across Europe. And there was an awful lot of fear in Britain about what that would mean for Britain's role. And you started to get stories about German invasion of Britain, things like the Battle of Dorking, and so forth. And they became a common thread. And then...
Hold on, one second, Paul. Let me just pause here. Oh, Jason, you back? Jason?
Sorry about that.
Okay, yeah, you would. Okay, continue, Paul. Jason just dropped out for a second.
So you got with War of the Worlds. Wells turned that whole idea of the German invasion of Britain on its head and had an alien invasion of Britain, which I think was the first alien invasion in literature. And then there was The Invisible Man, which took the idea of Jekyll and Hyde and turned it into, the man literally disappears. The man literally is not seen by anybody around us. One of the most potent and powerful images in science fiction. And then you've got First Men in the Moon, which was a long way short of being the first journey to the moon, because Kepler had written one in the 1620s, and Francis Godwin had written one in the 1630s. But it was still the first time in a long time that people had written about going to the moon and meeting alien creatures there. And those 5 books became the cornerstone of most 20th century science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really shaped it.
Jason?
I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that those stories of Wells and Verne were being reprinted in the pulp magazines, still through the 30s and 40s, so they were, when we speak of the golden age of science fiction, you tend to think of now, today, we think of the new authors at the time who were writing, the Isaac Asimovs, the Arthur C. Clarke, the Robert Heinleins, and so many others. But those pulp magazines were reprinting those stories that Paul was just talking about. Part of it is, part of it was a cheaper way for them to, you could reprint a story from back then and you wouldn't have to pay, or not pay as much perhaps. But it was also, people were still responding to it, and so you definitely those were highly influential and really set the stage.
Actually, those 5 novels of Wells, I don't think they've been out of print since they were first published, and that's rare in literature today.
Yeah.
In fact, the first definition of science fiction was Hugo Gernsback's definition, which was the H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Edgar Allan Poe type of story. So Wells and Verne and Poe were actually seen as the defining characteristics of science fiction, of what science fiction was supposed to be.
Well, let us talk about the pulps, because here in America, when I think of pulp stories, you think sometimes of the detective genre, but also, at least in sci-fi, the main name is Edgar Rice Burroughs here in America, and he's most famous probably for Tarzan, but then the John Carter novels come to mind, and it seems to me that right there, even though that's called science fiction, I believe John Carter goes through his mind, so in a sense that's sort of like a fantasy. And then the Martians aren't the Martians of War of the Worlds with their huge machines and their death rays. They're sort of like a throwback to the Roman era, more sort of like Tarzan on Mars. So that's almost sort of like original steampunk in the sense that there's a dissonance of the time era there. How popular was Burroughs, say, at least in American pulps, and was there a European equivalent to Burroughs in England or Europe? Either one of you?
Okay, first of all, when Burroughs writing, we were still at the period when there was no defining line. There was no division between science fiction, fantasy. It was still wide open, so anybody could write anything and tie it all together. And he was immensely popular.
Oh, yeah.
He was hugely popular. His stories were published and republished for donkey's years. Massive sales all over the place. But it was very American. I don't really think we have a similar thing in Britain. Partly because I think the literary history of Britain is a different history to the literary history of America.
I can speak a good bit about the Poles.
Yeah.
And actually, this is interesting. I have one of my favorite science fiction anthology autobiographies is Arthur C. Clarke's Astounding Stories. Basically, Arthur C. Clarke, one of the most famous science fiction writers, and really kind of set the whole stage for what science fiction is, and as we understand it today, after Wells and all the others. He gives his autobiography through the stories of Astounding Stories, which is the predecessor, which eventually became analog science fiction today. It was probably the most influential pulp magazine of the time for defining and creating what we're discussing as modern, the golden age science fiction, that what it became. Clarke, so he, in this autobiography, basically talks about how his whole life in science fiction started when he, as an 11, 12-year-old, 10-year-old child, discovered these magazines, which were coming from America. So we're talking, and it was like he said, like a light bulb went off, and he read this religiously through the years, and now the pulp magazines, especially Astounding Stories, and so many others back in the golden age, were immensely popular. I mean, their circulation runs were in the hundreds of thousands every month. You could find them at every newsstand. They not only did they present the stories that became known for creating the golden age of science fiction, they also formatted a community that became known as science fiction fandom. You had readers who would communicate with each other through the letter pages of these magazines. And then they would, from outgrowth of that, you had the science fiction conventions that started to be formed. You had fanzines, amateur magazines talking about criticism and other stuff that fed into all of this. And all of those really came out of the pulp magazines, because you had a period where science fiction novels were not really being published outside of the pulp magazines. I mean, you would have some specialty publishers who would do small print runs, but when you talk about Dan, you mentioned the Foundation series by Asimov. Those novels were originally published in pulp magazines, and it was only later that they were published in book format, years later. Today that would be something that people don't understand. Like, why wouldn't it was just a different publishing world at the time. So the pulp magazines really set the standard for what we consider as classic science fiction of the golden age.
There was a real difference between what happened in America and what was happening in Britain. Of course, the American pulp magazines only really came to Britain after the Second World War. They started coming in with the American troops during the Second World War, and then they were used as ballast in ships in the years after the Second World War. So British readers were picking up on those magazines only in the late 40s and 50s, and it was only then that you started to get British magazines appearing, like New Worlds most prominently. Before that, during the heyday of the pulp magazines, the 20s and the 30s, in Britain it was still a novel format. You were getting people like Olaf Stapledon and Catherine Burdekin and Storm Jameson and people like that. They were writing novels. There was no pulp journalism, pulp magazine for those stories to appear in. So you got the really big, in the case of Olaf Stapledon, very big and very complex works of philosophy.
Yeah, First Men and Last Men, I
yeah.
think, is his most famous work.
Last and First Men, and Sirius, and Star Maker, and Odd John. Really complex books, but very popular.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they would have sold in America at the time, but in Britain they were hugely popular.
Yeah.
But that was because they weren't seen as science fiction.
Yeah.
I think there wasn't the divide. Because we didn't have the pulps, we didn't have that division between science fiction and literature in the same way. There was a division, but it had the division between science fiction and literature in Britain comes back to an argument between H.G. Wells and Henry James.
Yeah, and Clark, in his autobiography, Astounding Stories, does comment on how hard it was to get the magazines from America.
Yeah.
You know, I think one of his neighbors in his village had copies, you know, initially. That's how his first exposure happened. But yeah, it's very different, you know, but in the United States, the pulps, you know, that kind of set the standard for what, you know, how a lot of what you call American golden age science fiction here.
Yeah, that's why the British science fiction and American science fiction throughout the middle years of the 20th century were very, very different beasts. Because they had a different publishing history, a different critical reception, and you know, America had the magazines, Britain didn't, and it actually does affect the way that the genre is written.
Continuing on with sort of a condensed history of science fiction, it has been mentioned about, quote unquote, the big three that came along in the 1940s, Heinlein, Clarke, and Asimov. But Paul had mentioned Olaf Stapledon, and I was thinking that there seems to be, I think when people just sort of gloss over sci-fi, you go from the pulps to the big three. But I wanted to talk about a couple of other writers in America, and then also talk about Eastern European sci-fi of the time, the 1920s and 30s. But two names that stick out other than Stapleton to me are A.E. Van Vogt, who to me is sort of the forerunner of that Buck Rogers kind of science fiction. And then the other one is, I think, Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay, which to me seems, I think it was published in 24 or 25. And I think that is, to me, one of the first, what I would call sort of, what we call maybe close to hard sci-fi, if you would. Let me just ask you both about those two writers, and if my sort of slippery definitions of them as Arcturus at least being sort of hard sci-fi, and Van Vogt being sort of the more high adventure sci-fi. Would you agree with that, Paul, and talk a little bit about both writers?
There are elements of hard SF in Voyage to Arcturus, but it's a very philosophical work. In many ways, it acts as a sort of intermediary between Wells earlier in the century and Stapledon in the 1930s. It's what bridges that gap between the exploration of the ideas in Wells and the development of those ideas along philosophical lines in Stapleton. So I think Lindsay actually fits in that really rather awkward little gap in the history of the genre.
How about you?
As for Van Vogt,
oh, okay.
I confess I'd never really had a great deal of taste for Van Vogt.
Well, his works have not aged well, in my opinion.
No, they haven't.
They were hyper popular in science fiction fandom in the 40s and 50s. His novel Slan, probably I think you could make a case for in American science fiction, was the first really hyper popular sci-fi novel to come out of to be published during the Golden Age.
Yeah.
And it had that slogan, fans or slans, which came out, which sounds silly these days, but basically it was basically saying, that science fiction fans at the time were basically saying, we are like the characters in this novel. we're misunderstood, but we really are the future, is what they were trying to say. But his works have not aged well, but they did set a certain stage for, what came after. If you read the novels now, a lot of his works now, at least the ones that came out during the Golden Age, you see why he has moved, not been held in the same regard as Heinlein, Asimov, and Clarke. The characterization is extremely weak, even by the science fiction standards of that time. The writing is questionable.
Crude, I would say.
I'll try to be nice. And the science is not very good. I mean, that's one thing that always gets me is, people talk about, I want my science fiction to be rigorous. Especially when you talk to hard science fiction fans, or hard science fiction being, scientifically plausible. But you read some of the classic, quote, works of science fiction from the Golden Age, and you're like, wow, the science of this is really very dodgy, even by the science of the time, which, it was not plausible. But
well, let me talk a little bit beyond the English-speaking world, because we haven't talked about that. Obviously, since we all speak English, we're going to be talking more about the English written word. But to me, one of the more interesting aspects is what would be, I guess, called behind the Iron Curtain, a lot of Eastern European writing, and we'll talk about other areas too. But I'm thinking of people like Karl, I guess, Kapek or Kopek, I don't know how you pronounce it, Alexei Tolstoy, and Yevgeny Zamyatin's We. Those are some writers that I have read in the past. They're not at the forefront of my mind. Was the Soviet Union and its sort of satellite states throughout the first half of the 20th century, was that sort of a neglected area where people are now just discovering works that didn't get the light of day back then? And how did their science fiction attitudes or techniques differ from the West?
In the early days of the Soviet Union, actually throughout the history of the Soviet Union, science fiction was a very important form of literature. The British and American science fiction writers were translated into Russian more easily than just about any other forms of Western literature. So all the writers there were familiar with Wells in particular. And science fiction gave them the chance to challenge, the chance to be subversive, satirical, inventive, in a way that the Writers' Union of the Soviet Union wouldn't allow for realistic fiction. Realistic fiction had to have, the representative of the people winning through in the end, and the glory of Stalin or whatever being recognised as what drives everything. In science fiction, they could play with that. They could twist it. Not always safely. Zamyatin's We was not published in the Soviet Union.
That's a great.
It was smuggled out and published in the West. It's interesting, but one of the first reviews of We that was published in the West was written by George Orwell, who, of course, actually basically copied the plot for 1984. You read the two books together, they're the same plot. They do different. He does different things with it, but it's the same plot. He used that. But yeah, so I mean, Aelita is, Tolstoy is an example of favoured science fiction in the Soviet Union. It was science fiction that did what the authorities wanted to do. We is an example of the unfavoured science fiction in the Soviet Union, but they were both important.
Yeah, and I have to. I'm not trying to dip into modern politics and such, but talking about how science fiction was used for to challenge and subvert and get around the boundaries of what you could do in the Soviet Union. That wasn't just in the Soviet Union. I mean, you have examples of authors in the United States and other around the world doing the same thing. I mean, the most famous thing is actually on, in pop culture is the Star Trek science fiction series using, science fiction to tell stories that, could not have been broadcast on network TV in the United States at the time. The first interracial kiss between Kirk and Uhura, dealing with these stories that are very pointedly about racism and other stuff that network TV would have probably been like, we can't let you broadcast that, if it had been a real, quote, realistic story. The Twilight Zone did the same thing. Literature, at least in the United States during that period, had much freer hand. But, so there's, and I do sometimes wonder if we're re-entering with a period like that, at least in the United States, with, when you're sitting there calling journalists enemies of the state, makes me wonder if, fiction, and especially science fiction, is going to be more important than ever to get some truth out.
Well,
I think there's going to be a big boost in American satirical fiction.
I think so.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
let me ask about what I guess we'd call the third world, especially early. Is science fiction, in a sense, limited to developed societies? Because it would seem to me that if you look in the first half of the 20th century, China, the Far East, India, Africa, Central America, was there any science fiction being produced? Or when you don't have, say, the technology, that sort of means that the writers there don't have the tools to even do that. I mean, they may have fantasy, but was there ever, in 1925, a great Indian sci-fi novel, or someone from Peru that's not been,
There was science fiction being written in India in the early years of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
There was science fiction being written in China. China actually is interesting because China had its own tradition of fantastic literature. And Chinese science fiction was not particularly recognizable as such to American science fiction readers, I think, probably at that time. It took a long time, still taking time, for the two science fiction cultures to actually begin to recognize each other. But yeah, there was a myth in science fiction throughout my early engagement with it, that science fiction was a literature of the developed world. And that's only because we were totally ignorant of the science fiction that was being written elsewhere.
Very true. I agree with that. I mean, and it's still, unfortunately, that ignorance still goes to a great degree. At least here in the United States, we have a dearth of translated science fiction, even fantasy. But there's not a lot of translated science fiction being put into English.
Same here.
We just had, it's starting to change. We had The Three-Body Problem by Cixin-Liu, won the Hugo Award. Been very popular here. Famous, one of the most, in fact, probably the most famous science fiction writer in China at the moment. And his novels are very popular here now and being translated along with his short stories. But don't pretend that is suddenly just the start of Chinese science fiction. I mean, there's a long tradition of it. There's same in Japan. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Thailand. They have Thai science fiction. It's never been translated into English. In fact, one thing I kicked myself on is at the time, I'm a young idiot, and when my teacher's like, "Oh, this Thai science fiction in Thai," I wish I grabbed copies to that later, bring it back or something.
Yeah.
In hindsight, I'm like, that was stupid. But it's part of it, I think, at least in the United States, is our culture is, we kind of think we're the end all and be all, and we're not as open to, we like to think we're the best, and it's to agree that you can say that about Western culture, and we say there is none when it means we haven't looked or we haven't even asked.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, here's one of the best, greatest, quote, the greatest Japanese science fiction novel of all time. 10 billion days and 100 billion nights.
Wow.
This came out in Japan in the 70s, and it was only translated into English, I believe this is 2011 or 2012. Yep, I'm sorry, it came out in 1967 in Japan, and it was translated in English first time in 2011.
Okay.
So, I mean, so when you say there is no, I mean, I can't even, that is so irritating. And there's other novels out. For example, in Japan, there's a novel. Won't go into it, but I'm dying for someone to translate this novel. I've heard so many great things about this science fiction novel, and it has not been translated. And all I can do is read about people saying, "My goodness, this is just the most amazing thing." And my Japanese is not good enough to read it, so that's that.
Well, Japan doesn't have much. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. Japan doesn't have much in translation. Even
African science fiction.
Yes.
We have a whole continent, and we don't know most of what's being written there, but it is being written there. There is science fiction being written in every single country in Europe, and most of it doesn't get translated into English, so most of it we remain totally oblivious.
Yes.
Well, let's.
There's some really interesting stuff. There's some wonderful Polish science fiction being written. There's some very, very good Czech science fiction being written.
Well, since you brought up Poland, Paul, I want to talk about you might as well mention Stanislav Lem seems to be one of the seminal figures in there. Solaris, the book, forgetting the Tarkovsky adaptation, that's an interesting book. Then he had another one that was adapted into a sci-fi film called Planet of Storms. I think it was called Planeta Berg. Is Lem sort of the, I guess, H.G. Wells of Eastern European sci-fi in a sense?
No, because he came. I mean, there was already a strong tradition there when he came along, but he was the breakthrough figure.
Yeah,
he was the figure that the West learned to recognise. He was the one who was lucky to start getting his books. Him from Poland, the Strugatsky brothers from Russia, started getting their work translated in the West, and that was our first awareness that there was science fiction being written there, and very different science fiction. Yeah.
Well, let me.
And it's interesting note with Stanislav Lem. I'm sorry, I always trip over his name, but the tension he made connections with like American science fiction community. And it didn't go well. I mean, people were like, it's like, he came from a different tradition of science fiction. And, I mean, you can go back through some of the history and, there was, I know the science fiction and fantasy writers of America, I think he canceled his membership because of, different political stuff.
I can't remember whether he cancelled his membership or he was expelled. He might have been expelled.
I can't remember the details, but it just goes to what I should look it up again. But it goes to the tension of people are like, well, that's not it's that tension between here's how we define science fiction and here's how other people define it. And it's so exclusionary that you're pushing away one of the world's great science fiction writers because he doesn't fit with your definition. That's how I see what happened.
There was a period from probably, the last major non-English language European science fiction writer who was broadly recognised in the West was probably Karel Čapek from Czechoslovakia. But after that, from 1930s right through to probably the 60s, there was a general assumption in America and in Britain that science fiction meant, by definition, written in English.
Yeah.
So that anything from another culture was ignored. It just didn't exist as far as people were concerned.
I mean, I've read some of the. There were a few translated Japanese science fiction stories published in English in anthologies in the late '60s and the '70s, and the introductions to these stories in the anthologies, you read them now and you're like, damn, because I'm not going to name the anthologies, or the editors, but you read the introductions and they're almost like, oh, isn't this interesting? They have science fiction. Well, we'll share this one little story with you, ignoring the fact that this is a story of a grand tradition in science fiction from a country that's been writing science fiction, since for decades, if not centuries too. Especially if you go back to the Teleginji and stuff like that, more than many centuries. But the attitude was, this isn't. We'll kind of let a little bit just peek through, but it's not. It's kind of very condescending, and it just that carried over to all of it.
But there were a couple of honourable exceptions. Damon Knight translated quite a lot of French science fiction.
Yes, he did.
I think some Russian science fiction. I think there was a collection of Russian science fiction he was involved in, but it was very much the exception. And the books disappeared almost without trace immediately, and that was it. There was nothing else to follow up.
Right.
Let me not spend so much time on the quote big three, because there's probably tons of stuff online about them. But I don't want to be remiss in not mentioning them. We mentioned them: Heinlein, Asimov, and Clarke. Why are they considered the big three? And was it more what they wrote, or just that they came along around the right time at the inception of World War II? What made them the big three, if you will, in English language?
I like the grin that I see on Paul's face. I think Paul should answer this. He's grinning on this, and I like to hear his answer.
No, I think that's a really interesting perception. Was it just a matter of timing? And to an extent, I think it was. They were the right people in the right place at the right time. But there was something else. They were trying to do things with the most familiar tools of science fiction. They were still trying to do things that changed it a little, that expanded it, that made it a bigger and a richer literature. Heinlein and Clarke in particular, I think this is true. Of the three, I tend to think Clarke is actually the best writer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Partly because Clarke had this really weird metaphysical streak that added a dimension to his writing in things like Charles the Zen of 2001. It was totally absent from most of the science fiction at the time. But they were expanding science fiction at a time when science fiction was ripe for expansion. The pulp magazines had become bigger. They had the readership, but there was also a market opening up for volume publication in America rather than just magazine publication. And they were the ones who were there with the work to exploit that and to become more widely known. So yeah, I think they were lucky in timing, in sense of timing, but there was also something that they were doing about.
Jason, do you have a comment on that before I move on?
No, I mean, I grew up on Asimov and Clarke. Clarke is my favorite author of that time period. I still reread some of his works on occasion. I agree. I think Paul nailed it on that. I mean, it was a good bit of timing. Obviously, they had the talent and ability to create the stories that people were responding to. But there were a lot more science fiction authors creating stuff then. But they're the ones that kind of hit. And but I think that's in every genre, every movement, everything. You always have a few people who become recognized as the big authors of the big deal. But that there's a whole level. There's hundreds of people under that who don't get the recognition, but who were producing stuff that's as good as anything. I mean, Theodore Sturgeon is one of the best science fiction writers, short story writers, I should say. But he didn't really write many novels, and so he doesn't get the recognition that the quote big three do.
We shouldn't forget Ray Bradbury.
Oh, good. Oh my goodness! I know
Something out he was sort of out on a limb.
Yeah.
He was not part of that. I mean, he wrote the pulp magazines, but he wasn't really part of that pulp tradition. He was doing something different.
He was.
And to a large extent, I think he opened science fiction out to a mainstream readership.
Absolutely. I mean, Bradbury is one of my favorite authors, and you're so right. I mean, we talk about the big three, but that's almost exclusionary, because that's, I mean, if you go back then to that time period and ask the general public who's your favorite science fiction writer, they would have said Bradbury in the late 50s and in the early 60s. If you went to the science fiction fandom community and said, who's your favorite science fiction author, they may have said Clark, Asimov, or Heinlein.
Yeah.
But if you went to the general population, Bradbury. I mean, he transcended genre and just reached so far beyond it. I mean, he blows the quote big three away. But that's again, I think that ties in with the myopia of the science fiction genre. It was very exclusionary, and part of that was the reaction at the time. Science fiction, if you were a science fiction fan, it was really looked down upon, at least in the United States, as quote children's literature. If you were an adult reading science fiction in the 40s or 50s, what are you reading that for? That's there's not an analogy I could give you now, except maybe it'd be like, I've heard someone jokingly compare it to, like, if you were reading a science fiction magazine back in that time period on the subway in New York City, people would give you the same looks as if you were reading porn. What I mean? I mean, it was really looked down upon.
Yeah, but
Bradbury really moved beyond that.
You had to wrap the books in plain covers to take them out to read.
Right, exactly.
There was that attitude.
Well,
yeah, and that would be why the science fiction community turned very insular during that time period to protect it, and understandably, So that's why you have the quote big three within our community. And Bradbury was accepted. He was very much accepted, but he was not considered. He was considered kind of, like Paul was saying, he was an exception. He was a part of us, but also beyond the community.
Well, let me, before we move on to what Jason has said was the new wave, let me just talk a few minutes about the subgenre of science fiction called dystopian novels. We talked about going back to Moore and Utopia, Zamayatin's We, 1984, An Animal Farm, which I guess more technically would be a fairy tale. I think it's called a fairy story. Fahrenheit 451 by Bradbury. Are most dystopian novels science fiction? Because certainly something like Gulliver's Travel could be considered dystopian, and that's clearly really not. That's more just satire. Is there a distinction between, say, satirical dystopian works and sci-fi dystopian works? Do you think?
I mean, you had some that were very purely science fiction. A Canticle for Leibowitz is one of the classic science fiction novels. It holds up amazingly well. It's still very relevant. Dystopian, pure science fiction. You have some Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, which she tries to deny that it's science fiction. I know her stance has gone back and forth, but so you can make the case. Some of them, yes, absolutely, are science fiction and come from the science fiction genre tradition, like a Canticle. But there's a long history in literature of dystopian novels. So I mean, sometimes I think they are almost their own thing. I don't know. I mean, you could technically say any dystopian novel is a science fiction novel, but that gets back to definitions and stuff. I think they also can exist on their own.
I tend to lump them all together, but that's because I'm very Catholic in my definitions of science fiction. I'll include anything in science fiction that I find interesting. But I find dystopias really strange. Before the middle years of the 20th century, you didn't really have a great deal of dystopias. You had utopias, and Moore and all the others that started out, and they were static societies. Nothing changed in them. The whole idea was that you had this perfect place, and because it was a perfect place, it didn't need to change. Then around the start of the 20th century, with Wells' A Modern Utopia in particular, you get the idea that utopia is not a static place, but is a place that's in a process. That utopia itself is a process of constant change. And somehow, and I can't quite work out whether it's the after effects of the First World War or the first inklings of what was coming in the Second World War. The idea became that we're not going to develop a perfect place, we're going to develop a horrible place. And then you suddenly started getting dystopias like Catherine Burdekin's Swastika Night, and then Orwell's 1984, and Earth Abides, and so on and so forth. You started to get the idea that these perfect visions are actually going to be completely reversed and become a vision of imperfection. And that's become the dominant mode in, broadly speaking, utopian writing for the last 60, 70 years. It's a very, very interesting process.
Well, let me talk about what Jason called the new wave. The term new wave has been used in many instances. New wave music of the 1970s. When I was a kid growing up, the old-time Godfather Mafia was being replaced by different ethnic gangs that were called new wave gangsters. But the term new wave, as far as I know, first started with the French new wave in cinema. Was the term new wave, did that precede it in science fiction, or was that something that was later put back onto it from the 70s? The term.
The Nouvelle Vague in French cinema came in the 1950s, late 1950s, very early 1960s. And when let's put this, there are two new waves in science fiction. So I'll talk first of all about the British New Wave, and then I'll talk about the American New Wave, which is a totally different thing.
Okay.
So the British New Wave started in 1964 when Michael Moorcock took over the editorship of New Worlds magazine. Now, that was a venerable magazine. It had been going since just after the Second World War. It was very traditional in its style. And Moorcock decided he'd introduce more literary style. He was egged on by Brian Aldiss and J.G. Ballard, and the idea was that he would bring into science fiction the literature of modernism. Now, modernism was a form of literature that had been completely ignored by science fiction before this date. You know, all the things like unreliable narrators and stream of consciousness and all those literary experimental things that you associate with people like Henry James and Virginia Woolf and James Joyce had completely passed science fiction by. You didn't get that in anything. And then Moorcock decided, and the British New Wave thought they would reintroduce this into science fiction. You got, things like Ballard's condensed novels and Aldiss's Acid Head War stories and so on, that were really attempting to do literary experimentation with science fiction. They saw science fiction as a way of doing this. And right from the start, I think, they saw a connection between what they were doing with literature, with science fiction, and what the French New Wave directors were doing with cinema. And the term New Wave came in very early. There are, well, as in so many things in science fiction, there is absolutely no agreement about who coined the term. One person who's supposed to have done that is Christopher Priest, who was definitely interested in the Nouvelle Vague cinema, because he is and always was a great cinephile. But there are so many other people who've been credited with that phrase that it's impossible to say now. But it was certainly seen as being doing the same thing as the French New Wave. cinema. And so the British New Wave was basically a form of literary experiment that allowed them to do things in literary fashion in science fiction that just hadn't been done before. And then American writers and editors, there were American writers in Britain at the time, people like John Sladek and Thomas M. Dish, who saw what was happening in the British New Wave and wanted to do something similar. And then there were American editors like Judith Merrill and Alan Ellison, who decided they sort of introduce the New Wave into America. But the New Wave they introduced was different, because this was America in the middle of the Vietnam War, and it was the time of two things: the protest movement and the counterculture. So New Wave in America became the literature of the protest movement and the counterculture. It became political, and it became an attack on censorship. The idea that you could do things. Before the New Wave, you would barely find a woman in science fiction, let alone a woman taking part in sex. The New Wave introduced sex as something that people did. You know, because it was breaking boundaries. A funny story. There was a science fiction bookshop in Manchester when I was first getting involved in science fiction, but also doubled as a porn shop, because a lot of the science fiction bookshops at the time did double as porn shops for some reason, and it was regularly being raided by the police. And what they'd end up doing is taking away all the porn magazines and everything by Isaac Asimov to read for themselves. And I always wondered how they felt after reading a porn magazine to read an Isaac Asimov book which had no woman in it.
Yeah. Well, you know, and what you're saying, I agree with Paul. I mean, that definitely connects with my understanding of the New Wave movement. Is you had, you know, the British New Wave and the American New Wave, and there was a lot of mixture. But the United States, science fiction was very restricted before the New Wave movement. You could write about certain things, you could not write about other things. Philip Jose Farmer's famous story, The Lovers,
Yes.
won the Hugo Award. I believe it won the Hugo Award, but it was the first science fiction story to really be write about sex.
Yes.
And that was a shock. I mean, it just shocked the hell out of people, which is like, are you kidding me? And you still had these, you know, you had Campbell with his with Astounding, which had become analog, and others who had very narrow views of what science fiction could be, and they would not publish certain types of stories. So the New Wave in the United States was very much about, like the counter-culture protest, to saying, we're going to blow this open, we are tired of this.
Yeah.
And they did. I mean, you know, it changed science fiction forever here in the United States, and I would say brought the United States more in line with the science fiction that was being written elsewhere in the world. You know, in some ways, our science fiction at that time had really stagnated.
Before the New Wave, I think American science fiction was seen, even by the people who wrote it and edited it and published it, as being a literature for teenage boys.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you know, there were things you didn't want to say to teenage boys.
Right.
So, you know, women, girl cooties, you don't want them in your fiction.
Right.
And then after the New Wave,
or let alone anyone who wasn't a white man.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask about the influence of television in making some names in sci-fi, because when I think of science fiction in film, other than Forbidden Planet, say pre-2001, most sci-fi was Roger Corman, AIP kind of, you know, crap here in America. But television, you had shows like Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, and then Star Trek. And these made pretty big names, I think, of some science fiction writers who went on to do other things. Most famously, probably in America, Harlan Ellison. I just on YouTube rewatched an old television show called The Star Lost that was created by Ellison. Very low budget, but it was one of the more existential attempts on television to portray sci-fi, even though it was, in terms of budgetary stuff, was at the Tom Baker Doctor Who level. Was there a similar I mean, did Doctor Who, for example, or Blake Seven also employ sci-fi writers in Britain that later went on to fame? And because it seems to me that Twilight Zone and Star Trek, especially, were two big impetuses in the careers of sci-fi writers.
Doctor Who, in particular, the name that springs out inescapably is Douglas Adams.
I was about to say yes.
Who started writing in Doctor Who? He was the script editor of Doctor Who for several years, and I have a vague idea. I think I read somewhere that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The first idea was for something for Doctor Who that never quite materialised, and he worked on it and became the Hitchhiker's Guide. So yeah. There was that, not to the same extent though. We didn't. The writers who came out, who became visible through shows like The Outer Limits and Twilight Zone in America, in Britain, they'd be more horror writers or Roald Dahl. A lawful lot of Roald Dahl stories we used for the short stories we used as the basis for television shows. God, I remember countless ones of them. But not the science fiction writers to that extent.
And I think don't overestimate how much the television writing was about giving exposure to science fiction writers in the United States. Yes, it did. I mean, Harlan Ellison famously wrote The City on the Edge of Forever for Star Trek, and it was full of drug addiction and all this other stuff, and basically Gene Roddenberry and others rejected the script and wrote it, and he eventually, Harlan disavowed it, and because it wasn't what he wanted, but it was about earning an income for those authors at that time. Harlan Ellison, had to earn a living in Hollywood. Many other writers, Lee Brackett, who is one of the famous Golden Age science fiction writers, she wrote marvelous stories. She worked in Hollywood to make a living. She wrote, I think it was The Big Easy, was one of her non-science fiction films she wrote. She actually wrote it with William Faulkner.
Yeah.
And she also then, at the end of her life, she wrote one of the early scripts for The Empire Strikes Back.
Yes.
It's because it was difficult to earn a living. So, I mean, I just want to throw that out there, is that that's one reason a lot of science fiction writers wrote for TV and movies, is because it was basically financial reasons. Also the same reason a lot of them wrote porn during that time period. I mean, many of the authors doubled, they didn't write it under their byline, but they wrote porn novels and stuff, because
same in Britain. Absolutely.
I mean, it was financial.
Yeah.
Well, let me talk about, before we get to, say, the last few decades, I want to talk about the guy who, in many people's mind, is sort of now considered the bright light, the quintessential sci-fi writer of the late 20th century, and that's Philip K. Dick. One of the reasons I wanted to do this show was that I'm not a Dick fan. I think he's very much the stereotypical sci-fi writer that people have in mind, and that he'll have a good idea, and then when you read his short stories, they are horrible. I mean, every adaptation of a Dick idea is better in film or in television. Every single one. I've read his short stories, and in fact, I'm doing a genre trilogy where I started with a Western, then a spy thriller, and my final book is going to be a sci-fi. And I stumbled across a gem of a terrible short story by Dick that that's actually in the public domain, that I'm actually going to use to deconstruct some of the aspects of science fiction, called The Skull, because it's absolutely terribly predictable, and to me it's quintessential bad Dick writing. number one, do you guys agree with me that Dick is horribly overrated versus other people of his era? And for that same reason is that every adaptation I've seen of him, whether it's a Schwarzenegger film or Steven Spielberg even made Minority Report, I think a better adaptation. Is Dick overrated? And then,
can I take this one, Paul?
Go ahead.
I've actually been reading a lot of Dick, Philip K. Dick lately. And I actually, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, Dan, I would have totally agreed with you. But again, what I just was mentioning about science fiction writers having to struggle to earn an income, that definitely applied to Philip K. Dick.
Yeah.
Okay, he really cranked out his stories. For the most part, he did not rewrite. And a lot of his short fiction is not good because he was cranking it out to earn a living. And so I have no argument with that. And like I said, a few years ago, I would have been like, yes. But then I started reading more in depth and some of his later novels and stuff. 2 points. What I mentioned earlier, how science fiction is almost a worldview. It's about creating and teaching humanity to see the world a different way. Philip K. Dick is a highly successful science fiction writer, no matter what you think of his writing ability, because he created our paranoia field look at current culture. I mean, I would go so far as to say that without Philip K. Dick, you wouldn't have someone like Trump elected president today, because Trump is elected on, hey, the whole system is corrupt and it's all conspiracies. That's exactly you could draw a straight line from Philip K. Dick's fiction to Trump. But there are examples. You need to read some of Philip K. Dick's great novels. I recently read A Scanner Darkly. It's amazing.
Absolutely.
I was like, my God. When Philip K. Dick took the time to actually polish his writing and work on his characters, he could accomplish great things. Ubik, another great novel of his. The Man in the High Castle. And every one of these novels, Flow My Tears, the policeman said, every one of those novels is one where he actually took the time to go back, and he didn't have to crank the fiction out to get the payday as fast.
Yeah.
And with those novels, they hold up as good as, they are classics of literature. Philip K. Dick wrote so many stories that it's easy to pull out horrendous ones. Trust me, he's got more than you're writing about. He grew up in the pulp tradition of the 50s. He cranked out the stories, but he also could reach amazing heights. And I think it's because of those heights he could reach that people were him, and he was so influential. Now, it doesn't mean every novel is great. He's got some bad novels, believe me, too. But, the ones that, the ones where he hit it and where he took the time to really focus and really refine that story are as good as anything in 20th century literature.
Yeah. Ditto. I'm actually something of a heretic where Philip K. Dick is concerned. I actually prefer some of his mainstream novels to most of his science fiction. I think some books like The Broken Bubble are absolutely gorgeous because they were the books he loved. They were the books he wanted to write, and he couldn't get them published. So he wrote science fiction to actually make a living, and that's why so much of his science fiction is rubbish. It's crappy. It was just written to get a quick book. Most of it turned out very, very quickly. But as you say, there are some books, Flow My Tears and Scanner Darkly, and I would say Now Wait Till Last Year and Martian Time Slip, that are absolutely, he got it right. He knew what he was going to say. All of his books were telling essentially the same story. The world is not reliable. We change the way we see the world, and by changing the way we see the world itself is different. And that was the same story he did all through. Actually, everything was doing the same story. Usually through drugs or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. I always think Trump D sounds like so much like a Philip K. Dick drug.
Yeah.
But there were half a dozen novels where he got that story right. And they're the ones that stand out. The rest of it you can dismiss because they're not worth it.
Right.
Those half-dozen novels are absolutely spot on. They caught the time, they caught the zeitgeist perfectly, and they still stand up.
And as an author, I wish I could write a half dozen novels that would stand like that.
Yeah.
I'd write 20 trash novels and 1,000 crappy stories to get those few that really hit it. And he does hit it on those occasions.
Yeah.
And I should throw this out there. I'm about 30 minutes. I'm about to run.
Okay.
My wife and I are going to see James Baldwin's that documentary, I Am Not Your Negro. So.
Oh, look at you.
Well, I know. I'm excited to see it.
Yeah.
Well, let me just then ask about the last few decades, because you mentioned people like Octavia Butler and Margaret Atwood and Dorothy Fontana is another name comes to mind. What has been the influence, say, in the last few decades with more minority and female writers in science fiction?
Well, I mean, go ahead.
Okay, the two best things that have happened in science fiction have been the discovery of women and the discovery of minorities, because they have opened up science fiction to so many new influences, new ways of looking. And if science fiction doesn't give you a shocking new way of looking at the world, then it's failing. The only thing that science fiction is for is to change your view of the world around you, and that's what Ursula Le Guin and Joanna Russ and Octavia Butler and Margaret Atwood and dozens of other women have done. They have made the world a different place for we safe, secure, white, prosperous, middle class men, because we see the world differently because of their fiction. The same with Samuel Delaney and Octavia Butler and N.K. Jemisin and Nalo Hopkinson and Taddy Thompson and people like that. They are making us see the world differently because the colour changes the world. It's like one of Philip K. Dick's drugs. You're a different person. The world is different. And that's what science fiction does.
And one thing to keep in mind is that same restrictions that you had the new wave movement of the 60s in the United States fighting against in science fiction, it extended beyond just the writing. I mean, science fiction likes to imagine itself. It was back in the golden age. It was just all white men. That's bullshit. I mean, there have always been all people in the science fiction fandom. I mean, people, Whoopi Goldberg, for example, talks about that formative moment when she saw Star Trek and realized, hey, there's a black woman here and she's doing stuff. I mean, and that there have always been women, there have always been people of color, there have always been people from cultures around the world who love science fiction. And to me, it comes down to the fact is, for many years, the science fiction in the United States, to a large degree, ignored that.
Yeah.
The powers that be. I don't want to say there's some secret cabal that controls science fiction. That's BS. But, people had a myopia where they didn't see what they didn't want to see. And, the people were always there. Cameron Hurley is one of my favorite authors these days. And she wrote an influential essay a few years ago. But basically, to sum it up, is we have always been here and we have always fought. And we have always, you just didn't see it. And that's the way it is. I mean, and finally now, we're starting to see more diversity and representation of other cultures and other people in science fiction. That's a great thing. Some of the most exciting science fiction I've read also is moving. I wonder if we're also in a period where we're moving past more of the restrictions on science fiction, where it can bring in more fantasy, like Paul mentioned earlier, boundary defying fiction. N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season is, I'm loving this series. It's a trilogy, award-winning trilogy. It is, I know it's fantasy, but in some ways, to me, it reads like science fiction too. Nydia Okafor's Who Fears Death is won the World Fantasy Award a few years ago. Mind-blowing novel, yet again fantasy, but I read it and it's like, wow, this is so much science fiction, and it merges the genres, and I love that. And there's just so much great stuff happening now, and I'm glad that I'm hoping we're entering an era where the restrictions that have been placed on the science fiction genre are yet again blown open, so that all people who want to take part are able to take part, and all stories that can be science fiction are allowed to be science fiction.
Absolutely. One of the things to remember is that these restrictions, these limitations, are not placed on science fiction externally. They're things that science fiction has chosen to do. They have chosen to blind themselves to what's going on. There was a story that at some convention or other, Gardner Dozois talked about Joanna Russ. This was in the very early 1970s when about the time that Female Man was coming out. And Gardner Dozois talked on a convention about Joanna Russ and was booed by the audience. They didn't want to know. The same thing with colour. A lot of the time they don't want to see the non-white writers out there. They don't want to see women, they don't want to see gay writers, they don't want to see non-white writers. They want it to be safe and secure and familiar and old-fashioned. And, when I was getting into science fiction, there was this big thing about science fiction is a ghetto. And yes, it was. And yes, it still is. But it's not a science fiction with a ghetto that other people have created. It's the ghetto that science fiction has chosen to put itself into. And if we open ourselves to these new writers, to these different ways of looking at it, if we make the borders porous so that we can get fantasy and mainstream and horror all merging into science fiction, the literature is going to be richer and we're going to be richer.
Right. I mean, what you're saying is so true, Paul. I mean, I love science fiction. I grew up on science fiction. It is my first love in literature, but it's also sometimes my greatest frustration because of the limitation science fiction places upon itself. Yeah. And it drives me crazy because science fiction, I know earlier we said we can't define science fiction. I still believe that's true, but at its heart, science fiction is about looking beyond the horizon, about looking beyond what we are right this moment, about trying to see possibilities. And it's so frustrating to me that the science fiction genre has that self-professed goal that has always restricted itself so much. And we still see this. We see it in the recent backlash against in the Hugo, the Rabid Puppies episodes and the Hugo Awards, where people are saying, well, we want to. It's almost like a counter-revolution. We want that old-timey stuff. We don't want we don't have to think about people who are different than us. We don't want to think about challenging themes or it drives me crazy because the genre is supposed to be about looking beyond, about expanding your horizons. And so many people who love science fiction and have helped create science fiction want to just restrict it so that disappears.
Well, I want to, before we do the last segment, I'll give you both a final say on things. I want to talk about sort of dropping in on science fiction because it was mentioned earlier, Cormac McCarthy and The Road, and I had just read Hoyle's The Black Cloud from the 50s, I think it was, and I think that's a good, solid early example of what you might call hard science fiction. Hoyle, of course, the guy who came up with the steady state theory. But the road to me is just such watered down Rod Serling Twilight Zone crap that it won an award. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's just utter garbage. And I mean, I read that literally. I mean, I think it's a 110, 120 page book or so. And I mean, it was just such crap. Do you think that science fiction has been affected by people with names elsewhere looking to maybe has there been like sort of celebrity sci-fi that has come up with writers from other genres just trying to?
God, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree too. Go ahead.
There are some. Paul Theroux's Ozone, P.D. James' Children of Men. The film was brilliant. The novel, shit. There are an awful lot of people who think they can do science fiction. They may have read a bit of Arthur C. Clarke when they were a kid or something like that. So they think it's easy, and it's not. And they get it wrong on just about every count. But there are others who come into science fiction. Michael Chabon with the Yiddish Policemen's Union, or David Mitchell with Cloud Atlas, who just get it absolutely perfectly right.
Yeah.
So that you can't lay down rules. Gravity's Rainbow, Thomas Pynchon, should have won the Nebula Award. He was up for the Nebula Award. He lost out to Arthur C. Clarke. It's there. It can be done. People do it. Sometimes they make science fiction new. They're making science fiction new. They're doing the best thing they can.
Oh, I totally agree with Paul on that, and I think part of it again ties back to how science fiction used to be seen. So if you were a mainstream literary writer, you didn't want to dip into science fiction tropes because it might tarnish your reputation decades ago.
Yeah.
Kurt Vonnegut, for example, fought really hard to try to have his fiction not seen as science fiction.
Yes.
Even though, I don't know if you know this, Dan, but Kurt Vonnegut was very involved in the science fiction community for many years. He went to science fiction conventions and workshops and stuff like that. But he saw basically, if I'm pigeonholed as a science fiction writer, it's going to hurt me as with general public. Again, Ray Bradbury is one of the few writers of that time period who was able to transcend all that. But I think part of it that fear is gone. So writers they look at it, even if you didn't grow up in the science fiction tradition, you're like, wow, I love the tropes there. I want to explore the stuff that you can only explore with science fiction. So that's a good thing. I have no problem, but some people do it poorly and some people do it great.
Well, Paul, let me just ask you then, if you can we haven't, like you said, we could go 8 or 10 hours just talking about this, so this is just sort of a brief primer, but if you could give just where you think written science fiction is going, and maybe some trends or writers that you think are going to be important in the next couple of decades.
Science fiction is going in about 3 or 4 different directions at once. But then it always has been going in 3 or 4 different directions at once. It's never doing the same thing. We need to look at new writers, minority writers, writers from outside the genre. We also look to writers who are trying to reinvent the genre. People like Alistair Reynolds, Stephen Baxter, are never going to completely rediscover science fiction or do something radically different. But they're using what science fiction does to do a very good thing, which is tell good stories. And that's important. It's always important to tell good stories. At the same time, you've got people like Nydia Okorafor or N.K. Jemisin or Nalo Hopkinson who are doing interesting things from a very different perspective. That sometimes, Nalo Hopkinson bringing in Caribbean rhythms into her writing, Nydia Okorafor bringing in African myths and storytelling techniques. So the newness coming in. The writers from overseas that we're seeing, non-English language writers like Cixin Liu and some of the writers from Africa. There are writers now emerging in the Middle East from Iran and Turkey and places like that we need to be aware of. But they're doing different things. So basically, we don't look for the science fiction to be going one way, doing one thing. What we need to do is for science fiction to be going everywhere at once, completely at random, and follow it wherever it goes that's interesting.
I agree with that. I can get my closing spiel too. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's going to be one trend. I think there are many trends, and it's science fiction is, despite what there's been some screams and hate and fights over it, but science fiction has expanded, and it's, if it wants to have a future, it's going to have to keep expanding. There is no other way about it. You know, I mean, it's one of my frustrations that if you look at the entertainment world, and I mean the whole world, not just the United States or Western, the biggest films, the biggest TV shows right now are science fiction. I just watched, I binged on The Expanse. Oh my God, I'm loving The Expanse. You know, so, you know, Star Trek, Star Wars, you know, video games are the biggest ones of science fiction. If every aspect of the entertainment world, the biggest movies, everything are science fiction except in literature. In literature, fantasy and other genres dominate more than science fiction. And I think the reason for that is because science fiction for so long restricted itself. It became so insular that you had to be an insider to enjoy, to even read science fiction. I think a lot of new authors are breaking that apart. I think the trends are going to be I hope science fiction expanding where, hey, we're going to take this genre and let it be whatever anyone wants to make it be. Authors like Ken Liu, who also translated The Three-Body Problem from Chinese. You know, his fiction, I mean, it's wow. Cameron Hurley, I love, you know, some of her new space opera. Wow. You know, N.K. Jemisin, Nydia Okafor, Nina Allen is a British author who I'm loving, and she's doing things which are truly exciting in science fiction.
I second Nina Allen, but she's a friend, so I've tried not to.
Yeah, well, I'll plug her because I love her fiction. I love it. Immediately, I mean, her short fiction and her new novels. You know, none of those writers I just named, and all of them are people I follow avidly, none of them are doing the same thing, okay? And that's great. That's what science fiction needs. You know, and some of them dip purely into fantasy at times, others back and forth, but they're, you know, I see science fiction is going in many different directions, and that's a great thing. Because the worst thing for science fiction is if it keeps restricting itself, so that you can have a world where people say, I love science fiction movies, but I won't even pick up a science fiction book because I can't read that crap. So
the thing to remember is that what we're doing now, talking on Skype in two different continents, that's science fiction. The tablets we use and the mobile phones we use, that's science fiction. We live in a science fiction world. The things we're doing now, the technology we have now, was unimaginable 20 years ago.
right.
Science fiction is the literature that people's everyday experience.
Well, let's end it on that note.
I'm going to have to get going, Dan.
Okay. Yeah, well, let's end it on that note, and I want to thank Jason and Paul for spending some time talking about it, so thank you both.